Magic the Gathering is a trading card game developed and manufactured by a company called Wizards of the Coast, who first created the game in the early 1990s. Since then, Wizards has printed hundreds of new cards each year and is still going strong today. The cards are designed with fantasy artwork and are generally themed around one of 5 colors. These colors can be endlessly combined with each other, allowing each player to use a completely different deck for a completely different experience each time they play. Also simply referred to as Magic, or MTG, it is primarily a 2-player game that often is casually enjoyed in the home of a friend or with a group of people. But it has also become so popular that there exist a series of tournaments sanctioned by Wizards of the Coast in which professional Magic players compete with each other for hundreds of thousands of dollars. These internationally broadcast professional tournaments take place all over the world and go by names like Grand Prix and Pro Tour. So why am I making this documentary? I'm currently pursuing a Master of Divinity degree, and my focus in that degree is on Theology and Culture. I only started playing Magic the Gathering about 6 months ago, but the more I get into it, the more impressed I am with its status as a cultural phenomenon. In an effort to explore this phenomenon a little more closely, I interviewed a few of my friends who are also fellow players. I hoped to discover some of the reasons why this game resonates with millions of people, and also to figure out why Christians should even care about it. Jerome Blanco is pursuing the same degree and emphasis as myself. I caught up with him on our campus to talk about the game.
So, how did you first get into Magic the Gathering?
Reluctantly. I was actually reading an article in around April that talked about how expensive Magic the Gathering cards could be, and I thought, this is ridiculous. I'm never gonna play this game. Why would anybody play this game? And then around that time, I went on a church retreat, and a couple of my friends were playing, and I thought, okay, interesting. And then my brother emails me and says that he started playing, and I'm like, okay, maybe there's something here. And I end up I'm just in Target, just for a normal Target run in May, just like a month after I've read this article that said I would never play Magic. And I see the cards there, and I see the decks, and I think, well, people at church play, my brother plays, maybe I'll buy a few cards. And yeah, the rest is history.
Chris Ramsey is also pursuing a Master of Divinity degree. He's the person who introduced me to the game 6 months ago.
How did you first get into Magic the Gathering?
Yeah, so I think my first experience with it was probably when I was in like 5th grade or something. I think some of my friends had some cards, but never really played seriously. And then when I was in college during my senior year, I used to be a track athlete, and I was actually hurt a lot that year, so I had a lot more free time than I was used to. So I was just in the bookstore, and they were there, and I think I had a gift card, and I just thought I'd, buy a few for fun and see what it was like, since I hadn't played in 15 years or something. And it just went from there. I mostly just played casually with a few friends, but probably about in the last year, a couple people I know I have been playing it a little more seriously, which has been a lot of fun.
Andy Cooperfauss is a relative of mine. Not only does he play Magic, but he also makes his living running one of the most popular websites associated with the game.
Yeah, I'm the editor-in-chief and content manager for channelfireball.com, a website that's actually just a reseller of Magic cards. So Wizards creates the game, and it creates a huge secondary where players sell their cards and retailers buy their cards and resell them, buy for $1, sell for $2. And in order to bring people to the website, we use content written by professional Magic players or just players who are, particularly about how to get better at the game, how to build certain cool decks. They make videos about how to get better at the game. I plan our content schedule for that. I edit the articles for copy and content. I also edit the videos. I work with the authors on coming up with new ideas, things like that. So basically from top to bottom, I run the content side of the web, which is for SEO and traffic generation purposes. For me, I got started when I was in 3rd grade. I lived in this apartment complex with my dad in Las Vegas, and all the local kids just played this game, this weird card game called Magic. And, it was a funny dynamic where the older kids would teach the younger kids. Some of the rules were a little more sketchy back then. We didn't quite know what was going on. But we pieced it together enough to play games. I got started playing tournaments around the same time. Just within like a couple of years, had no idea what I was doing. Showed up to my first tournament with like a 100 card deck. The minimum number is 60. Playing more than 60 is generally not advised. And ever since then, I've been playing casually until high school when I went on a little hiatus. But then once you get to college, it's cool again. Geekdom is mainstream now. It's geek culture now. There's Marvel movies in every movie theater now and on every TV screen. So it's cool to have like a geek hobby. So I picked it up again, and then now it's my career.
How would you describe Magic the Gathering to someone who has no idea what it is?
Yeah. The phrase I often use is it's a sort of game that's kind of a mix between poker and chess, but then there's like dragons and wizards going on with that. So it's kind of a silly combination, but it's a cool game.
It's hard. You know what I would do is I would probably show them a card and try to explain from there, because it's really hard to just talk about it theoretically. I guess I may use the word fantasy, because people know what fantasy is. There's dragons and swords and magic. And so, really, in a sense, if you understand what a video game is with fantasy and magic and swords and wizards and stuff, you can just kind of say it's like that, but in cards. I think that's one way to approach it, even if that's a gross oversimplification.
What do you enjoy most about Magic the Gathering?
Probably several things. I'm definitely like a strategic thinker, so it's a good outlet for that part of me, especially when I play more competitively, when the goal is to win and figure out the best possible strategy out there to win. But it's also a very interesting game to play socially. Even though it's kind of a combat sort of game, there's a lot of interaction between the players and dialogue you can have. And it's because there's that creative element where you're building your own thing. It's really easy to talk to other people about what they're doing or give each other tips. It's just a good social activity you can do casually as well with people, and that's a lot of fun.
I think I like the mix of the strategy, because I like strategy games. I like games where you can kind of think, but I also like that you can build your own decks, and that whole creative element about it I really like, because I'm an artist and I like creating. So those two things put together, you feel like you play a deck of 60 cards and you've made it yourself. And yeah, I just think there's something fun in that. Also, I came into Magic at a time when a lot of dragon cards were being printed, and I just think dragons are cool. So it's like they hooked me, they got me in.
The thing that I like the most about Magic is the way that it lets you sit down in a social environment with your friends. A lot of the games that were all video games, and then they became PC games, and then you play over the internet and you don't see the person that you're playing with. And I actually got back into Magic to meet people. I was in college, I had just transferred, I didn't know anybody. I started playing World of Warcraft with my roommates, and after a little while, I gotta stop this. What can I do? And I said, I can go to my local game store and play Magic. And sure enough, some of my best friends from Columbus I met playing Magic. So the best thing for me is when you can just sit down on a Wednesday night with 3 or 5 other buddies, have a couple beers, and play a game that is at its core very social. You communicate through the whole thing.
In your opinion, personally, what would be an ideal game of Magic?
An ideal game of Magic for me is one that involves a lot of back and forth, close games, and sort of divergence points that you have to make a decision and say, I'm going to go this way, I'm going to go this way, and then that decides the outcome of the game. And the more that happens, the more interesting the game is for me. I don't care particularly if the cards are especially good or powerful. In fact, it seems like the most interesting games of Magic are caused by those games when both players don't have all their resources at their disposal, or one player isn't firing on all cylinders. You can engineer games like that with the kinds of cards that you play. Sometimes they just happen by luck. Some stats are more conducive to that kind of game, but those are the ones that I like.
I think there's two ideals, because for me, it's at one level a very competitive thing that I do, and at another level, it's something I do to have fun with friends. So in the later context, an ideal game would be not so much a game, but one in which a setting in which maybe you've got a bunch of people together that are just hanging out, playing with each other, having a good time, laughing, joking about stuff, not taking it too seriously, and just having a lot of fun. So in one sense, that's an ideal. And then in another ideal is where I'm in a tournament playing for high stakes against a good opponent, and it's a really good game, but I happen to win.
I think it would have to be fun. I recently went to a tournament and just had the most fun game, and a lot of it was about the person I was playing. You kind of have to both be willing to have fun, and I think there's respect that goes into it as well. You kind of respect each other's decks, respect each other's players. Where I lost a game, well, it was a match of 3 games, and I lost the first game, but it was awesome because the cards he put together to do it were just great, and I just had to say, yeah, you got me, and that was good. And like, I'll remember that going forward. That was just a fun game, and I think we have to be having fun. Sometimes I stress out and I go to tournaments thinking I need to win, and my friends remind me, just have fun. And I think that's what it's really about. But an ideal game, I would say a lot of good card draws, a lot of luck on both sides, and yeah, both players just making their decks work. Because when both decks work, you kind of just see the awesomeness of the game with the best cards against the best cards, and it's really fun.
Nowadays, you primarily play casually or professionally? A little bit of both?
Well, the great irony of having a job that involves Magic is that I don't get to play very much. But when I do play, I play with my friends just casually with my cube. It's just like a collection of powerful cards that we put together ourselves. It's not sanctioned in any way. I still do play competitive tournaments from time to time, usually online. The last time I showed up for a legit sanctioned Magic tournament in person was like last year or something like that.
Nice. So,
but I did used to do that. I qualified for the Pro Tour at one point.
oh, cool.
I played the game pretty seriously competitively. I was never that good. I did get that far. I did make the Pro Tour.
Who do you usually play Magic with?
I play Magic with friends at church, often. I play Magic with my brother. He lives in Japan, and we Skype, and we tilt the screens down so that we can see the table in front of us, and we put our cards there so we can see each other's cards and not our faces. And that's how we play over the internet. So I do that with my brother. And I also go to game stores and just play with strangers. You just go in on a weeknight when a store is hosting Magic, and you pay $5 to play. It's great. You meet people, and you get to see a lot of different decks, a lot of different styles, and I get to know people.
When you play with the people at your church, do you play outside of regular church hours? Or is it something organized by the church?
Oh, no, definitely not organized by the church, although encouraged by one of our pastors who has seen the community that it's fostered, actually. So, yeah, I think it's been great for community at church. And so it's not organized by the church, but yeah, I think it's certainly influencing the community at church.
Do you typically prefer to play with just you and one other player, since this is a 2-player game? Do you typically prefer to play in that format where it's you and one player and that's it? Or would you rather be playing in a group of people with everybody playing sets of the game?
Yeah, so if you're playing for fun, if that's the main goal, is just to have fun, I think having more people is often a good time. I mean, if you want to just, meet up with someone and get a chance to have a good conversation and have an activity, playing 2-player, just 2-player can be good. But the other circumstance in which you'd want to do that is if you and the other person are really just trying to practice for a competitive environment.
When we play, we usually play a form of Magic that's called draft. So you all sit around the table, and together you sort of pass cards to each other to build a deck. But when you play the actual games, it's 1 versus 1. And I've always enjoyed the head-to-head competitive aspect of it. But yeah, multiplayer Magic is experiencing an explosion in popularity right now. I think the social aspect of it has to be huge. I've tried it, and I get kind of bored because there's a lot more talking than there is playing. I think that appeals to a lot of people, that it's sort of the new hearth or something like that.
I think it's nice to get a lot of people together so that you can play different types of decks, and different people. You just switch and rotate who's playing who. When you start playing the same deck over and over, it can get a little boring. Yeah, because I think there's so many cards out there, and there's so many ways to build decks. There's so many styles of decks. In Magic, we call it the meta game. Like, the meta game is always shifting. The meta game, yeah, you kind of want to experience all of it. And I think you get a bunch of people together. It's just more fun because you can also. It's even. I find it fun to watch if a game is going well. And so if there's the unlucky odd person out, if you get an odd number of people, it can still be pretty fun, I think.
Speaking of watching other people play Magic, remember those internationally broadcasted professional tournaments I mentioned earlier? I spoke with Andy about his website's involvement in that aspect of the game.
Actually, we cover so Wizards contracts with us to run Grand Prix, the largest open Magic tournaments, and we cover those via twitch.tv. So we'll stream them live with commentators, video of the matches. So I'm the director for those shows. They have me run the coverage of those shows from, pretty much start to finish. It's like 3 16-hour days or something like that. It's pretty brutal because Magic tournaments are long and you have to be there before they start and after they finish. But it's fun. We show the board state, we show the players, we try to find interesting stories, and the commentators have to talk for like 12 hours straight.
Have you ever watched any of the televised Magic?
I watch a lot of them. I watch a lot of the Pro Tours and the Grand Prix. I think that people who play Magic need to watch them if they want to make good decks. I think if they're not watching them, they're missing out a lot. Plus, it's really entertaining. They have commentators and everything. It's like sports, but you don't really move much. Yeah.
That is steel, though, from Mike Sigrist. Well done. I mean, just to be able to put yourself in that seat and go, no, this is the correct play. I'm going to go to three cards.
Joel just gets to attack for lethal here.
Yep. There's the block. And target me. There's the match. Yo, Larson is the champion of Pro Tour Magic Origins.
So there you have it. One of the strengths of Magic the Gathering is its ability to bring people together and foster a sense of community. It provides a common activity for people to watch, talk about, and participate in together. But the same could be said about many other forms of recreation, both sports and games. So what makes Magic any different? One distinguishing characteristic is the way in which the game lets players customize and bring their own individually assembled decks from their personal collection of cards. I asked my friends to tell me a little bit more about this process.
Tell me what deck building is.
Right, so a lot of the time when people play, you have a deck that's made up of cards that you own and have acquired, and there are certain limits in terms of like how many of each kind of card you can have. Like you can't have more than 4 of one unique card, and there's a minimum of like 60 cards that you have to have at least in the deck. But aside from that, the game is very free form in the sense that the cards can interact with each other and with your opponent's cards in a very very large amount of ways. So there's many potential interactions between types of cards. So trying to consider all of that, you build your own strategy by choosing the cards that you want and fit together in your deck. So when this is done casually, you can just throw together things that you think are cool and see how it works. But when you do it in a competitive environment, it's a very long, well, not always long, but it's a very involved process where you're considering what are my best options for me to play, but also what are the best options other people out there are going to be playing, and how is my strategy going to interact with theirs. It's a very interesting sort of game theory problem.
For me, because I come across so much information in a day. I read the other strategy websites, and I edit every article that goes up on our page, which usually are articles intended for players who are playing at the highest level of competition, people who want to be on the Pro Tour and stay on the Pro Tour, who want to be professional Magic players. That's their end goal. So for me, deck building is all about just finding the best combination of cards to beat a potential opponent in whatever format I'd be playing. So, formats have specific parameters and guidelines of which cards you can use. So I'm always on the lookout for just what looks like it will be the best, have the highest win percentage. I have some preferences and biases toward certain styles of play, but by and large, I just look, oh, that deck looks like it's good. I'll build that and then tinker with it.
And how do you approach deck building on a more casual level?
Yeah, so it's a very common dichotomy, of playing to win or playing to have fun. And when you're in a setting where you can play to have fun, people will maybe try to build theme decks, for example. Like, I want every card in my deck have to do with goblins or, bears or, just you can imagine. Or because the game is so free flow and there's like really weird gimmicky strategies to win, like people will try to do things like that. Like, I'm going to win by like putting all the cards in my deck in my discard pile and then pulling them back out, or something crazy like that might not work in a competitive environment, but people just like goofing around and trying to find interesting things to do.
So every deck needs to have something that can win the game for you. Somehow you've got to get your opponent down to 0 life, and you need a win condition, a win con. Some decks have many of those, some decks have few, but you need at least one. Ideally more, but you need something.
So the idea of a win condition is in saying, if I get these combination of cards, or if I get this dude out that can fight, that's how I'm planning to win the game. And especially when people are playing in a more casual environment, sometimes they'll try to get win conditions that are less typical or might be comical just because of what the card is, or it's perceived as weak or kind of gimmicky. But when people can get things like that to work and actually win games with fun interactions, they really enjoy that.
Can you give me an example of one of those types of interactions, just fun or gimmicky?
Yeah, sure. So there's a set of older cards that I haven't played with, but I've read about, where the way that they try to win is they generate a lot of squirrels. They try to make a massive army of squirrels and then attack the opponent with them, which are like small little creatures that, you just try to swarm the board and get around their stuff. But it's just, insult to injury if you get beaten by a pack of squirrels.
So there are aggressive decks or aggro decks, which just say, we're gonna just keep on attacking, and those usually use the color red, and their win con is basically everything. Just everything is just gonna be thrown into offense and trying to win, and that's what the deck does, and that's the deck story. That's what it's gonna do. Or you have usually blue decks, which will take their time, which I like to play a lot. I had a deck that had 3 creatures in it, just 3 out of 60 cards. That was my win condition. Everything else was just trying to slow the game down. Everything else is for me to take control. Those are called control decks. And then when my opponent can do nothing and I can do everything, I put out one of those 3 cards and try to win the game. So you kind of every deck has a goal. Every deck's trying to do something, and you put the cards in that'll help it achieve that.
In Magic, there are considered 3 pillars of deck archetypes. So there's aggro, decks that just attack your opponent, try to get their life total from 20 to 0 as quickly as possible. Control, decks that try to reach a state where the opponent can't do anything that you can't answer, and then from there, winning is strictly academic. You find some way to end the game. It doesn't really matter how, because everything's all locked up at that point. And then combo decks, which combine usually 2 or more cards that, when put together, win the game instantly, or at least do enough that your opponent can't win anymore. Of those decks, I tend to gravitate toward control decks. Those are the decks that play a little more of a longer game. They give you way more decisions, because by nature, the more turns in a game that you play, the more decisions you get to make. And it's all about answering your opponent's spells and trying to find the right solution to what they're doing. So I don't know how good I am at playing those decks. The best players in the world play control decks for the same reasons that I just stated, and I'm not one of the best players in the world. So it's possible I should be trying to attack them instead. But yeah, there's something very appealing about the answers, and it's kind of more like a puzzle. And if you figure it out, it's very rewarding, because your opponent just has to sit there and watch you win for 10 minutes. And Yeah.
So the deck I have right now, actually, which happens to be my competitive deck, is kind of a weird circumstance where the theme actually fits pretty well with a competitive strategy. The colors and the sorts of cards I'm using in my deck all have to do with sort of like nature and playing these giant monsters, or having these guys that are like shaman that'll like tap into the power of nature and use that to power your cards. So it just has a bunch of like giant dragons and ogres and like elementals and things like that. And the way I try to win is I try to throw out these giant things as quickly as possible and smash my opponent with it, which is actually not that popular right now in the format. So it's kind of interesting to match that up against people that are trying to do these more intricate things with their decks. So another example of a sort of deck that the way it works is really kind of fueled by one of the cards in the story is this card called Rally the Ancestors, and it's based on this like clan of people in the story that have ancestor worship and will like honor those people that have gone before and died. And what the card does is it takes all of your sort of dudes or monsters that have ended up in your discard pile, and it brings them back out at a critical point in the game to help you out. So in that sense, even though it's there mainly for the gameplay mechanic, but what the card and the idea behind the card really fuels how the deck works.
The way in which players build their decks, especially when playing casually, can often begin to tell a sort of story with their decks. And that's not by accident. Let's talk a little bit more about the rich backstory and lore of the world in which this game takes place. One of the most unique things about this card game is the story behind the cards. The backstory of each event or character depicted all blend together to form a rich narrative. There are even official novelizations and short stories that depict the lore of each new set of cards. But it was not always this way. Early sets did not have a cohesive narrative, but were rather loosely based on mythological and fantasy elements. The gradual increase in the amount of lore associated with its cards gave Magic perhaps its most distinctive feature, a mythological backdrop to ignite the imaginations of its players.
So Magic the Gathering, I guess the setting of the game is the multiverse.
What is the multiverse?
Yeah, it's just the set of possible worlds that the game has visited. So some examples would be, there's a very interesting set called Innistrad, which is kind of like a classically gothic horror setting place where all the landscapes look like romantic art, and there's zombies and werewolves and vampires and things like that. Or you might have another set where there's one called Ravnica, where the whole world is this giant city, and there are these guilds there, and there's 10 different guilds, and they all sort of occupy a different space in the cultural life of the city, and they attract different kinds of people and things to them. And that set was all about sort of like the intrigue between those guilds and the interactions between those different strategies.
Does that show in the cards?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So a lot of times that the stories that they'll make in the set will be very connected with gameplay mechanics that they create. So for example, in the Ravnica set with the city, each of the guilds had a unique color combination. There's only 5 different colors of cards in the deck, but each of the possible 2 color combinations was one of those guilds.
There's a story that goes on in each plane. There's a sort of history unfolding on each of those planes. What ties it all together are the planeswalkers.
And you as a player in the story of the game are a planeswalker yourself, and that's why you can take cards from different worlds and put them all into your arsenal that is your deck, and then use those to fight for you.
As you can probably already tell, the aspect of artwork is of vital importance to Magic the Gathering. I believe that by unpacking this a little bit further and figuring out exactly why, we may begin to discover some of the ways in which this game could be incredibly important to us as humans.
How important do you think the artwork is to the game of Magic?
It's huge, because if you're just playing a game where you have these blank cards with text on them, no matter how strategically intricate it is, it's just not going to be that interesting to most people. I mean, there might be some hardcore gamers that would do that, but for most of the audience, like, they want something that's aesthetically pleasing. And I think even for people that play the game competitively, and I count myself as one of those, the fact that the artwork is interesting definitely adds like a large component to it. It just makes the gameplay more enjoyable. Even though it doesn't, technically add anything to the strategy of it, it's just a much more fun experience when you're looking at a table full of colorful and interesting artwork.
Yeah, you'll see people who I've met people before who say, "Oh, Magic, I remember that game. I didn't actually play, but I really like the artwork, so I collected the cards." Magic has employed an incredible array of fantasy artists through its history, and it's really it's really a point of connection for a lot of people. And I have to say that I find myself sitting there just looking at art and being amazed by the level of detail and how intricate and interesting some of the artwork in those cards is.
So what Wizards who makes Magic has been doing lately is they're actually making all of the cards, the art on the cards, match something in the story, which is really fun. So there was a tournament, I think it was Dragons of Tarkir Pro Tour, and there's this one card, it's a dragon, and in the story he actually defeats, he like kills this guy named Tasigur, who's kind of a punk. And so there's a card with Tasigur on it, because it's Tasigur the Golden Fang. But there's a card called Dragon Lord Silumgar, who's the Dragon Lord who defeats Tasigur, right? And in Tasigur's art, or in Silumgar's art, you can see him wearing a necklace where Tasigur is dangling off of his neck. And I saw a match on the Pro Tour where someone played a Tasigur, and then someone played a Silumgar, and he basically used Silumgar to get rid of Tasigur. It's kind of complicated how, but he did. And all the commentators were saying, that was great. It just basically lived out the story. You can see it. You can see him hanging on his neck on the art, and that just happened in front of our eyes. So that was pretty cool. And otherwise, the art's just really pretty. They have good artists who just work on those cards, and it's just fun to look at some of those cards sometimes. Especially the land cards, where they just draw and paint these beautiful terrains. It's just, sometimes I just like looking at them.
Yeah, so land cards are these cards that allow you to play every other card in your deck. And there's a basic set of them that it's like a mountain, plains, forest, basic features like that, that have a pretty standard format. And the cards in general are usually picture for about maybe 40% of the card, and the rest of it is text or symbols that tell you what the card does.
No, the most recent set, Battle for Zendikar, features something that's not typical. Full art lands. Yeah. Why are those so valuable? Why are they so desired?
They just look great. I actually have some right here, and there's one. I don't know if you can see that, but it just looks cool. I think that's the appeal. It looks cool. It's a swamp, and it's dark and dreary.
So the full art lands, for some people, they're a status symbol. There is an element of that in Magic. Some cards are like shiny, and those are more expensive than others. Some cards are unique in certain ways, and having the full art lands is sort of a way to put your stamp on your own deck. So the basic lands are kind of the most generic card in Magic. They're the foundational piece of any deck. You can't really build a deck without basic lands, with very few exceptions in Magic's history. So having unique basic lands that sort of say like, this is Andy's deck with Andy's, not just anyone's, because most basic lands look the same. So the ones that look different, I think, are an easy way to personalize your experience.
I think if you're thinking about the story of the game too, you kind of, the full art kind of makes it seem like it's set here. This is happening on this place, on this plane.
This is something Magic as a game does, is it has different worlds that it creates, and the sets visit those worlds. And sometimes what they do is they will go back to worlds that they've had in the past. So about 5 years ago, they had this set called Zendikar, and the basic story behind that was that it was a very open, expansive world, not a lot of people, a lot of like fierce natural events, and exploration was a big part of the set. So the natural landscape was almost like a character in the set itself. And then in the most recent set, there's been a catastrophic event on Zendikar, and the people that are there are rising up to fight against these monsters that have come to basically consume that world. But because there was that existing theme of nature, the land itself is a character. And aside from the lands just powering your other cards like they do in normal sets, they added this new rule in the most recent set where the lands can turn into these like creatures or monsters that can fight for you.
Tell me, when you're playing the game, there's a rich backstory with the cards, and there's this whole universe, this multiverse that's been created to kind of serve as a backdrop for this game. It's not just a game with random cards with numbers on them. There's a whole story behind it. How aware of you are that while you're playing the game?
When I was a kid, I read all the books about Dominaria, and that's like the original plane, the first world. They spent a ton of time there in Dominaria, and they had this cast of characters, this crew of the Weatherlight that they followed through several blocks and sets. And for me, I got pretty engaged in that as a kid. I always remember thinking to myself, man, they should make a movie out of this. It sounds like they might actually be doing that now. I'm not positive, but
yeah, I think they're talking about it.
Yeah, now they started jumping around a lot more. They go, from Mirrodin to Kamigawa to Ravnica to back to Dominaria to Lorwyn, and it's harder for me to get engaged with those things when you have it for a brief period of time. And most of the competitive Magic players that I know also don't tend to get engaged with the lore. Some of them are interested in it, but for the people who are focused more on like what card beats what other card, there's not a lot of time for the lore. But on the other hand, I've noticed that they're returning to familiar planes more often. It used to be that they would just jump to a new one every time. And the last few cycles, they've done Scars of Mirrodin, which was a return to an old set, and they did Battle for Zendikar, which was a return to an old set, Return to Ravnica. They're clearly trying to make world building and setting a more integral part of player experience, that you have these places that you recognize, that you connect with in some way. I don't know if that's going to work. They've kind of just started doing that again. But I have to say, for me, when they stuck with a place and with characters, then I did get very engaged with it. And once they stopped doing that, they kind of lost me. So I'm hoping that comes back into it.
Researchers have explored the idea that Magic the Gathering players use their imagination to engage in creative world building, especially in the context of fantasy imagery. In 2004, Brett Martin, Associate Professor of Marketing at the University of Auckland Business School in New Zealand, shared the results of his study in the Journal of Consumer Research. Although his study was focused on the implications for marketing, his research proves that when people play Magic the Gathering, more often than not, they are exercising their imagination in a way unlike when they play other games.
Would you say the story comes alive more to you while you're reading that backstory and that mythology, or while you're playing the game?
Definitely while you're playing the game, I would say.
I think it's a little bit of both. You kind of have to have that interaction of reading it. I think that if you're not reading the story, it's hard to get the feel of it just from playing the game. But when you're playing the game and you know the story, I think it really becomes full there, where you get to, especially if your deck brings the story together, and you just actually take the time to look at the art on the cards, and it kind of brings the story to life by having these tangible things in front of you that are representing that world or the planes and all that are there, and they're moving and they're interacting and doing things. Yeah, when the story and the game clicks, it's just really fun.
Yeah, I think when it comes to just seeing how all the cards fit together, I'm someone who always sort of like appreciated and enjoyed inventive worlds and stories like as I was growing up. So I think it just taps into a lot of that. And it's in a way where you can kind of run with it in your own imagination.
I try to imagine myself on the plane. I try to think of myself in the world. I don't know how much I feel like I'm interacting with the story as much as reliving it, or maybe trying to live it out a little differently. I don't know. It's kind of like reading a book, I would say. or now a lot of video games are very strong on story, and they emphasize story, and it's in a way more interactive than reading a book because you have something to say within the story. So I'd say it's kind of like playing video games with good stories. Yeah. For casual games, you can get into that a little more. I think if you're in a tournament trying to, win a bunch of prize money, you're just trying to win a game. It's up and down.
Have you ever heard anybody object to Magic the Gathering?
Not really in a long time, but I can remember when I was younger, maybe elementary, middle school, I remember being in more conservative Christian circles thinking that it was bad. I think at one point my parents didn't want me to play. And, I think because it does have some traditional, more like fantasy themes of like magic and wizards and things like that, if we're real, those are things the Bible doesn't really agree with. And to be fair, in that perspective, the game's been around since 1993. And when you look at some of the cards from the very, very early years, in the early to mid-90s, they do have, the art has some of the more traditional kind of occult sorcery imagery to it, which is not in there at all, really, today. It's just much more stylized and kind of cartoony, standard sort of drawings. So in that sense, like I can see a little bit why people were more uptight about it back in the day, but yeah, I haven't heard anything about it in a long time.
I've studied fantasy literature, so I've thought about this a lot, actually. So I guess people look at certain passages in the Bible that talk about witchcraft or things like that and sorcery and kind of assume all these things with elements and power and all that are the same, or they don't really understand that the way that magic is used in not the game, but magic in general is used in culture and media is used very differently. So I had a professor who talked to me about Harry Potter and explaining that magic there is used as a technology. Magic is a sort of parallel to science where there are rules and there are things that you do to make other things happen. And that is very far from, say, invoking the power of demons or gods to do something, which I think is kind of closer to what's going on in the Bible. So yeah, I think we just need to be better readers of both the Bible and culture, and then we would see that there's not that much to worry about.
Magic the Gathering not only evokes entire stories in a fantasy setting, but also allows players to feel as if they are somehow a part of those stories. This common theme in the fantasy genre of drawing people into the backstory of a world is one at which masters of fantasy such as J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis excelled. The C.S. Lewis Institute has published an article by Professor David C. Downing in which he notes some of the differences in Tolkien's and Lewis's approaches to creation of fantasy and world building. Tolkien viewed creation of fantasy worlds as a form of worship, a way for humans to model their creator by engaging in creation themselves. C.S. Lewis held a similar view, but approached world building from the understanding that once a world has been created by an author, it can instantly be changed and built upon by a person who engages with it. The same is true with Magic the Gathering. As players engage with the created worlds, they often continue the process of creation by engaging their imagination. But more on that a little bit later. I asked my friends what their thoughts were on different types of fantasy material. Do you like other fantasy lore? Do you enjoy other forms of fantasy, literature, film, games?
Yeah, I've been into fantasy ever since I was a kid. Actually, the first legit novel I ever read was The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, and ever since then I've been reading fantasy books. Grew up on fantasy. I play fantasy RPGs and watch, the fantasy movies that come out. And I would consider Star Wars fantasy also, and I was huge into Star Wars all my life. And the crossover between the two is hard to avoid. Magic draws on a lot of fantasy tropes that have existed for a long time. I mean, orcs and elves and goblins have always been you can see them borrowing from Tolkien and sources like that all throughout Magic's history.
I used to be really into fantasy. I love The Lord of the Rings, as many people do. I love Narnia, as many people do. Harry Potter is brilliant. I also actually love the Silmarillion. I like the Silmarillion more than I do The Lord of the Rings. And Yeah, I'm not even sorry about that because the Silmarillion is genius. It's just genius, and it's basically just a history, like this mythical history of things that never happened. It's a history book of made up things, and it's beautiful. And Tolkien is a genius for making it. And just love that he's just built a whole world, and there's something about that that I really enjoy.
How would you compare the level of mythology in the world of Magic the Gathering against the world of J.R.R. Tolkien's works or C.S. Lewis's works?
Yeah, I would say, well, for one, I think Tolkien has a much deeper. It goes a lot much deeper with Tolkien than it does with Lewis, especially in terms of the histories and how, the depth with the language and how that all fit together, and imagery of how he constructed his world. I would say the way Magic does it is much more surfacey. And some of that is because I would say a lot of the story comes not from the text or the short stories that authors write. I think it's more derived from the art, and perhaps just the names of the cards. And like we were saying before, I think people kind of fill in the gaps themselves as they see it as a cohesive picture and as they see the cards interact.
The story of Magic is not, it's not literary genius. They have to keep it going. They have to, they have to keep the game going for as long as it's been going. So you're gonna have redundancies, and you're gonna have the same bad guys trying to do the same thing. They're still pretty cool when they do it, but I think I would compare it more to something like Batman, right? Where you see the Joker over and over again, you see the Riddler over and over again, you see Robin over and over again, and it's like they find ways to make it new, but it's also kind of not new. But it's not a bad thing. It's just a different way of storytelling. It's a different way of keeping people in the world for a long time. And I think that's great because sometimes you just want to stay in a world for a long time. I think people are sad that Harry Potter stops after book 7, and there's a reason people write fan fiction. There's a reason people are excited that they're making plays now for the Harry Potter universe, because you want to stay in a world, and I think Magic does that. That's something that fantasy literature can't do in a sense. It's limited.
So how do you think that playing Magic and taking part in that is different from simply just reading and consuming fantasy?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's always better to have agency. It's always better to be an actor. So, yeah, when you get to command the army of elves to go, do battle at Mount Doom or whatever, that's a lot more fun than just reading about it sometimes. And I know for a lot of people, Magic is a way for people who have been sort of ostracized throughout their early lives, to like take things into their own hands. I know a lot of kids who grew up and they got bullied for being nerds or geeks or whatever, and Magic kind of lets you participate in the narrative in a way that other forms of fantasy don't. It's not passive. You get to find a friend and then beat the crap out of them with your cards.
Nice. Chris's wife, Allie, is pursuing a degree in marriage and family therapy. She has been playing Magic casually for about 2 years, and was able to briefly share some of her perspectives on the importance of world building and imagination.
I think world building is important in that there's like meaning making that goes on in world building. So there is a therapy, like an entire kind of modality of treatment that's called narrative therapy. And I mean, that has to do with the narrative that you have for your life. But it can be very powerful for people because the kind of narratives that we start to tell about ourselves can really dictate like what our options are. So basically we have a choice in the narratives that we do create and the relationship that we have to our story. And so I think that there's probably some kind of connection in what kind of world building people do when they play games and in other contexts as well. So I do think that one of the draws of Magic is that it's not just like your cards are competing against each other and it's like, oh, who's better at playing, but also this feeling of like, oh, it's kind of like we're just playing Magic, but also it's like part of this epic story that really is like lots of little pieces. So you get the sense that like, I mean, if you wanted to create like a book or like a novel, I think from the cards, you totally could. So there's a lot of room for it being kind of like an exercise of strategy, but also like a escape in imagination, and so I think that's one of the draws of the game.
The artwork on the cards often depicts either just a character in the lore of Magic or an event that happened in the lore. When you look at those cards, or even when you're playing with those cards, do you ever find yourself either consciously or subconsciously continuing the events that happened, imagining what happened before or after that image that's depicted?
Oh, definitely, definitely, especially cards that just like particularly cataclysmic or whatever. It's hard not to look at it and imagine that sequence of events or what the aftermath looks like. And you'll see people play the cards and make the sound effects that go along with them. I certainly like to do that. And I know my boss, the vice president of the company, Louis Scott Vargas, was once one of the best Magic players in the world. He still makes the sound effects when he plays the cards, that like go with the
Yeah, I think you definitely do that to a certain extent, because a lot of the times, yeah, it's not like a portrait. It's usually a picture of some sort of action taking place. So I think our minds naturally sort of like turn that into a little scene, especially because the action is generally implied in the artwork. So in that sense, I think people's imagination, again, really brings it to light.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the art is definitely depicting a scene, depicting action going on, like a battle or confrontation between two characters, and you kind of call to mind the story and think of what's going to happen next, or think of what came before. And yeah, it's certainly they take these snapshots of the story and put it in front of you, and yeah, they help you really feel like you're in it. I think Wizards is doing a better job of doing that, and yeah, I think it's great.
How important do you think imagination is to us as humans?
Well, hugely important. The dawn of time, being bored has been sort of a fundamental part of human existence. So, daydreaming, staring off into space, we've been doing it all this time, and that's where new creative ideas come from. And the sort of expression of creativity through deck building and putting cards together and things like that. That's same sort of use of imagination that has been a critical part of human expression forever.
How important do you think imagination and world building is to Christians?
Of the utmost importance, I think. I very influenced in the sense by reading some Brueggemann earlier this year, and he talked about what the prophet's task was actually to expand the imagination. That's really what they're doing. For Jeremiah to be talking to people in exile and saying that there's something to come back to, which it seems like in their circumstances that's not possible, but his words enact this world that is not there yet, but it says, look, there can be something else. Look, there can be something that you will come home to. That's what the prophets do. They speak and they stir up the imagination. They really don't do much. They don't do much. They say a lot. And with those words, they open up the imagination to think there is an alternative to what is before us now. I think that's what the prophetic task of the church is. That's what Christians should be doing, is we need to be saying to the world, look, there's something else. And through our lives and through the stories we tell and through everything we do, we need to be saying, look, there's something else. Look, imagine something other than just what's in front of us, or other than how we think things are. There's something else, and the only way to do that is with the imagination. So imagination is of the utmost importance to the church. If we don't figure out how to incite the imagination of others or ourselves, we're really not gonna do much at all.
How good do you think Magic is at being an outlet for creative expression, for imagination?
I think it's great. I think I've never seen a kid who played Magic who I didn't think was sharper than the average kid who didn't play Magic. Like, if you were to take a random sample, give them a vocab test, I guarantee that the Magic playing kids would do better on average. Magic teaches you so many skills, from vocabulary. Like I said, I remember asking my mom what chasm meant, 6 years old, and she was just floored. And it teaches you how to piece together pieces of a puzzle. It teaches you opportunity cost in a really important way. Once you learn that thing about 60 cards is the minimum, but it's also the right number, and that if you want to add something, you have to subtract something that you already liked. That's a critical skill for life. It teaches you communication skills in a way that games don't. I don't know if I would say that, the Magic playing populace has the best social skills in the world, but I think they probably got better social skills than the average gamer. And I even financially, it teaches you some skills. Magic cards have gotten pretty expensive these days, and knowing how to budget has become strangely relevant in deck building, especially for people who want to play on a competitive level. It can be hard to get in, so finding a way to use your cards, if you want to play two different decks, finding where there's the most overlap so that you don't have to buy more cards, those kind of skills come into play too. And like I said, I started playing this game when I was a kid, and now I've got a job that involves it that I think has also given me like a ton of marketable skills. Not even the technical side of it, the stuff that I learned from Magic and from reading about Magic, I'm going to be able to apply somewhere down the road,
I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of Magic the Gathering. I hope you've been able to gain a better understanding of this game and of its merits. I echo the sentiments of those I interviewed when I say that this game is an incredible tool for bringing us together and for helping us as humans to exercise our creativity and our imagination in a way that no other game really makes possible. I wanted to end this project with a little bit of bonus content and also give you a deeper insight into some of the cards of Magic the Gathering. I asked each of the people that I interviewed what some of their favorite cards were and the reasons why they were their favorites, whether it was for the gameplay mechanic that the card represented, for the artwork on the card, or for the backstory behind the card. I'll start off by sharing some of mine and then share theirs. So one of my favorites, and it's a card that currently represents the deck that I'm trying to build right now. It's called Hardened Scales, and basically what it does is it adds more power to your cards. As you play it, everything that you would normally attack with just gets multiplied. You gain an additional power of attack on top of what you're already using. And so I have a deck that's built all around that and just trying to give as much power to my cards as possible in what's not traditionally an aggro color combination, but I'm trying to kind of make it one through this card. It's kind of the key to that deck. So yeah, that's one of them. Another card that I really like goes kind of along with the theme of Hardened Scales, but this one is Hangerback Walker. And what it does is, first of all, it's a relatively rare card, and one of the reasons I like it is because in a booster draft that I participated in recently, I opened this card out of the pack, and I had been looking for it for a while, and I just happened to come across this card, so it was a nice find. And it's a really powerful card, and it's really fun to play with. Basically, as you progress throughout the game, you have the option to add more power to this creature, and this creature becomes more and more powerful periodically throughout the game. If your opponent ever destroys this creature, instead of just it normally disappearing and that being the end of that, the amount of power that you've added multiplies, and if you have, like, let's say a power level of 7 or 8, then you would have 7 or 8 individual little creatures that are all suddenly swarming the battlefield and taking over. So your opponent is very reluctant usually to destroy it, because if they do, instead of having one powerful creature to deal with, now they have tons of small creatures to deal with, which is almost as bad, if not worse, in some situations. So it's just a very fun, interesting gameplay mechanic, and it makes games really interesting because you could approach it so many different ways. You could use it so many different ways. So yeah, it's really fun. And another card that I got from a pack is actually a really awesome, fun card. It's called Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger. And he is a legendary creature. He is an Eldrazi, which
in the Battle for Zendikar set, they're these massive creatures that just consume everything around them. Just all of existence is just swallowed up into a void of existence wherever they go, and they just consume everything. And Ulamog is kind of the main bad guy of the Eldrazi, or one of the main bad guys. And he has indestructible, so once you get him out, he costs a lot to get him out, so the deck that I use him in is designed to try to take that cost down as much as possible. But once you get him out, there's basically a 2 or 3 turn clock that your opponent is now under, and your opponent will lose the game in a couple turns, because every time he attacks, if they don't deal with him, that is, every time he attacks, the opponent has to get rid of the top 20 cards of their library, and when they have no more cards in their library, they automatically lose the game. That's just a rule of the game. And so this guy makes it really easy to take your opponents down, because at most they'll have less than 60 cards in their deck, and he gets rid of 20 at a time, so 2 or 3 turns, and if your opponent can't answer him, then they're not going to be around for much longer. So he's a really fun card to play with. Hard to get out, but once you can get him out onto the playing field, it's really fun. And another card that I like is Ajani, Mentor of Heroes. He is a Planeswalker. He just has some really nice artwork. First of all, he's a lion, like this awesome legendary Planeswalker, and one of the main reasons why I like him is just because the condition at the very bottom of his card says that if you have gained enough power with this particular card, you have the ability to gain 100 life, and that's just unheard of. There's not really any other card that I know of that does that. I could be wrong, but I'm not familiar with any. Just to gain 100 life is insane, because you start out with 20 life. Each player starts out with 20 life, and it's usually pretty hard to get rid of more than that very quickly unless you have a super aggressive deck. But in any deck, any combination of decks that you're playing, if you have 100 life, you're going to last a very long time and have a lot of time to really kind of recover and survive and do anything you want, really, to outlast your opponent. So that's actually really cool. It's just like a super silly, overpowered mechanic. Really fun little tidbit, though. He's fun. I like him.
So, one of my favorites, I might say this is my favorite card, Dragon Lord Kolaghan. She's my favorite because she looks awesome. She's the 4-winged dragon with lightning behind her. In the story, she doesn't even speak. A lot of the other dragons speak to their people. She doesn't care. She just destroys and does whatever she wants. And I think it's awesome. She's black and red colors, which I just think is a cool color combination. And she's great. And honestly, she got me excited about the game. And my first deck revolved around her. So a lot of that's sentimental. A lot of it's the art. She just looks really cool. I actually don't play her in a deck because she's not the best right now in the current metagame. She can't really do much against competitive decks, which makes me very sad. But I still believe that someday I'll be able to put her in, just because she is so awesome. And you really can't see it, but I have a playmat that has her art on there, and so the picture's all blown up, and you can see that behind her in this storm are just hundreds and hundreds of dragons just flying behind her, and they look like flies because there's so many, and she is the best. So someday she'll be in a deck. I do love dragons, so Dragon Lord Ojutai is one of my favorites, and I have forced him back into a deck of mine because he's just so good. He looks cool too. He lives on a monastery and he just meditates all day. He's like a dragon with feathers, and he just he's doing this on the art, and he's pretty wise, I guess. And he's great because he's a dragon. He's also his mana cost is relatively low for a dragon, and that means you can play him a little earlier than you would for other big creatures. He has conditional hexproof, which means that sometimes he cannot be targeted by spells, which is great because your opponent's going to usually have cards that are trying to kill your creatures, trying to get them in the graveyard, and you can't do that to Ojutai when he is untapped, and it's great. It's great because it's just harder to kill, so he can get a lot more done. He also, when he hits your opponent, lets you draw some cards, which is great because card advantage is the most important thing. Well, I say that as a blue player. Some other red players might disagree. Dig Through Time is one of my favorite cards. It is banned in many formats because it is so good. And this card is just all about card advantage. This card is all about getting the cards you need. What it does is you get to look at the top 7 cards of your deck and pick 2 of them, put in your hand, which is very, very good. It doesn't sound that special, but that is very good. You can find what you're looking for if you need to kill a creature of an opponent, if you need to find a dragon of yours, if you're just looking for another land so you can do something. Dig Through Time can find it. And usually you can find another dig if you're running 4 of them in your deck. And you just keep chaining those digs, and yeah, it's hard to stop. It's what some players will call the engine of the deck. A card like Dig Through Time just keeps you going, keeps you drawing cards, keeps you having resources and answers to whatever your opponent's doing. So this card is very, very good, and I love it very much, and it's part of why I play blue. Elspeth Sun's Champion is a card that is no longer legal in the format that I play, at least. She has rotated out because she is too old, so Magic rotates cards out so that, I mean, it keeps the game exciting, but it also makes the Wizards a lot of money that you have to keep buying new cards. But Elspeth Sun's Champion was one of my favorites when she was around, and she is a planeswalker, so she's not a creature, she's a little more special than that. And she is awesome because she basically just has the power to summon lots and lots of soldiers every turn, which can flood the board. Your board presence, your board state is important in Magic. Talking about how many creatures you have, how much you fill the board, and she just fills it really fast, and it just gives you a huge advantage. Plus, she's just awesome. In the story, she's dead. She was killed by a god, I think. But there's talks of her coming back to life somehow. So fingers crossed for that happening soon.
So one of these guys here that is probably one of just my favorite cards for flavor, just as kind of like a fun thing. He's called Niv Mizzet the Firemind. Probably the thing I like most about him is he's like a monster, but his types is he's a dragon and a wizard, which is just kind of a fun combination. And in the story of the game, he's almost like a mad scientist that has these nefarious schemes that he tries to, achieve. And in the gameplay, he does a cool combination of things where he can damage something and then draw a card at the same time, which, I don't know, it kind of captures his, calculating, gathering you knowledge, but at the same time, dealing damage to stuff, because he's a dragon, so it's kind of fun. So this guy here, Sarkhan Unbroken, is one of those Planeswalker cards where he's like one of these powerful guys that can go between worlds. And when you play them in the game, it's like that they kind of come next to you as like an extra player. So he can do a couple of different things. And the reason I picked this guy out is because he's kind of the epitome of what I'm trying to do in my competitive deck. Which is to throw like big things out as quickly as possible so he can just give you like dragons for free out of your deck. But he can also draw you cards and allows you to play other stuff quickly. He's just very versatile. And he's also made up of all the colors that are in that deck. This one here is probably, it's funny to say, but is the card that I would say I'm most sentimental about. It's called Stormbreath Dragon. And this guy, I actually don't really play with anymore because in a competitive environment, usually they play what's called Standard, where you use cards from the last 2 years or so. And this guy is no longer legal in Standard. But when I was like just getting into the game and starting to play more competitively, this guy was sort of the last piece I added to my deck to where I was really competitive with good players, and I did very well in tournaments. So for that reason, I think it's like symbolic of me like becoming good at the game, and I just think the art looks super cool, and he was always a fun card to play with. He was a dude that you could throw him down. He was a giant dragon, and he was super fast. He could just hit your opponent right away, and it always felt really good to do that. So I was definitely sad when I couldn't play with Stormbreath Dragon in my deck anymore.
I like Bitter Blossom. That's my favorite artwork on a card, I would say. I tend to like blue cards. I find those the most interesting. So you've got cards like Cryptic Command. And like I said, I like cards that offer a lot of decision points, that allow you to take longer turn and more, and that answer what your opponent does. And Cryptic Command does all of that. It has 4 different modes on the card. You choose a combination of 2, so that on its own gives you plenty of permutations. And then each one has just an incredible amount of flexibility between each one. So the amount of decisions that you get just from playing with one card is incredible. And then I would say Sensei's Divining Top is another one. That's a card that actually is the subject of some controversy in Magic now, in that it takes too long to use. So there's a reason for that. It lets you look at the top 3 deck and put them back in any order, basically as often as you like. So some players spend a really long time doing that. But it's one of the most complex cards to play with. It's difficult, and every time it's a puzzle, especially with the deck that it commonly goes in. There's like a right answer, and figuring out what it is over and over again is pretty fun. I would say that my last favorite card is completely different than that, and that's Sulfuric Vortex. It's basically a card that just does damage to each player every turn. It only goes in a certain kind of deck, and that's the kind of deck that doesn't care about taking damage also. And it's basically the exact opposite of all those other cards. It makes sure that they've only got this much time to make their decisions, and if they don't do it, they lose. And I like kind of putting someone to the question of, can you deal with this in this amount of time? And if you can't, you lose.
Thanks for watching.